Hi, everyone. Welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and local guy who actually likes chocolate covered raisins, Blunchley. In this episode, the conservative case for localism, or why I think conservatives should view localism as a viable way to achieve their political objectives. I don't have studies or conservative writers or anything to back my arguments up. This is very much going to be an informal discussion where I raise a bunch of ideas for you to accept or reject at your leisure. I do think they're persuasive, but you might feel differently. One really important thing we have to address at the top. Despite me about to talk a whole bunch about why I think if you're a conservative you should support localism, I am not, capital letters N-O-T, not a conservative myself. If you've been listening so far, you would know that I am exactly what my voice would imply. A mildly soy lefty who has worked for the federal government and probably doesn't agree with you on much politically. I want to make that very clear from the top because I don't want to accidentally create the impression that I'm one of you or otherwise be dishonest. So if I'm not one of you, why should you listen to anything I have to say about why I think conservatives should get on board with my pet project of localism? Well, I don't really have a great answer for that. I'm not sure I'd listen to a conservative who was like, no, trust me, bro, I promise this idea I'm pushing is actually super in your interest. But let me say this before you just turn off the podcast. I don't agree with conservative political positions, it's true. However, I am genuinely committed to the idea of localism and the idea of an America where local governments self-rule and the federal government doesn't have ultimate preemptory power anymore. Why? Because, to be honest, I don't want to have to deal with y'all anymore. I want to just be able to do my lefty things in my little blue corner of America and have you guys do your righty things in your little red corner without either of us being able to mess with the other. I'm sick of a winner-takes-all federal system where if I want to, say, pass a law about pollution so that things change in my community, I have to go and get the federal government to pass a law that's going to apply everywhere instead of just where I live. That means my preferences, my laws, are going to fuck things up where you live. And I'm sick of the opposite, where a conservative politician in Florida or Texas gets an idea of how things should be there and has to go to the federal government and make things that way everywhere in the country in order to accomplish that, which fucks things up where I live. When that's a dynamic, where getting things done at home requires you to impose rules on all Americans, of course the knives come out. Of course we end up with a national political mood where people from different parties can't stand each other. And it's just the same thing at the state level. I want to be able to do things in my left-leaning town without fucking things up for people who live in conservative rural counties, and I don't want those people from the conservative rural counties saying how things should be run in my neighborhood. Basically what I'm saying is this. You and I probably don't agree about much of anything on how politics should work. But the one thing we do probably agree on is that we are sick and tired of each other and just want to be left the hell alone. By making all local governments self-governing and taking away power from the federal government, that's exactly what localism does. And because I'm committed to achieving that ideal of handle shit in your own community and otherwise mind your own business, it's in my best interest to try and present genuine reasons why conservatives should consider localism. Because if I can present genuinely convincing reasons instead of a deceptive mirage, then maybe I can get you to agree that localism is a good idea. And if I can get you to agree with me, well, then that's one step closer to being able to let you guys go do your thing elsewhere and get out of my life. With that, let's get into it. So here's my slightly too cute pitch for conservatives. The Republican Party and other conservative parties are aligned on the idea of small government. The more you give power to big, distant authorities, the more that power will be used either in inefficient and fraudulent ways or to abuse the populace. Because of this, naturally, it probably makes sense to have the smallest and least expansive form of government be the one that calls the shots, right? Well, what's the smallest level of government in America? The federal government? State governments? Nope. It's local governments. Whether it's in terms of total size or jurisdiction or tax dollars spent, local governments are the smallest governments in America. Doesn't it make sense that the party of small government would want to, embrace small governments? But obviously you're going to need more than that. And part of the reason you might need more than that is because if you're a conservative, the federal government is maybe looking pretty damn nice right now. We've got an active president who isn't afraid to take bold action to achieve conservative priorities. We've got an administration that's dedicated to rooting out corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse at the federal level. Federal agencies are actually closing themselves up or are finally pursuing a conservative agenda in areas like immigration or gender issues or the economy. Conservatives control both houses of Congress and the federal judiciary. Conservatives also are overrepresented in state legislatures. Given all the good stuff happening right now, why would you ever want to throw all that away and pursue a system that disempowers the very federal government and state governments that are delivering all these great results right now? Put another way, if I want to convince conservatives to support localist reforms, I kind of have to explain why, despite things being better right now than they have in a long time for you, things overall still kind of suck if you're a conservative. I also probably need to explain how the Trump admin is actually causing problems that are going to come back to haunt conservatives in the future, and how a localist system would do a better job on delivering on conservative priorities than even this very successful conservative administration. So let's start with a pretty straightforward one. One of the reasons that Trump has been so good at getting things done is because he's taking a very expansive view of what the president can do. He's shutting down agencies, taking on political opponents who try to interfere with him, invoking wartime powers to achieve domestic goals, calling for activist judges to be impeached, and firing the heads of nominally independent agencies on the grounds that limits on presidential appointment power of agency heads is unconstitutional. He's leaning on law firms and universities to make sure they don't get in the way of his agenda, and getting them in line by threatening their funding, or client base. He's bringing up all these arguments for why there are circumstances where the executive can ignore a federal court order. I mean, this guy really represents a pretty amazing paradigm shift on the limits of executive authority. He's being more active and more bold than any other president in modern history. He's created all these new levers of power that are accessible to the presidential office. And that would be great for conservatives if conservatives could be sure that they controlled the presidency forever. And I don't care how optimistic you are, you can't think that now there's just going to be a Republican president forever. What's going to happen to all those levers of power once the pendulum swings the other way and it's a Democrat sitting in the Oval Office? Oh, sure, the liberals are putting on a big show now of being all horrified and upset by the way Trump is running his presidency, but behind the show, they're licking their chops. They're thinking, hell yes, this guy just created the precedent for us to really make some changes around here next time we win an election and it's our guy in the White House. Let me paint you a negative picture. It's 2032 and J.D. Vance loses an election for a second term to, kind of hard to think of any remotely viable liberal political candidate right now, so let's just make a dude up, Bob. The first day that Bob is in office, he fires the heads of every single executive agency and replaces them with liberal officials. He signs executive orders mandating that OMB implement mandates, policies, programs, and activities relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion. He fires every member of DOJ and abolishes the agency without congressional approval. He signs other executive orders demanding that all federal materials replace all instances of the word sex with chosen gender, getting rid of historical names of Army bases, requiring that all federal employees prove they have received vaccination for a list of 20 illnesses, and unilaterally declaring that all student loans are now canceled. When a district court holds that Bob lacks the authority to unilaterally cancel student loans and issues a nationwide injunction, Bob calls for the judge to be impeached and succeeds in getting Congress to do his bidding. Alternatively, the district court judge doesn't even have the authority to issue a national injunction, thanks to a law that congressional Republicans are literally trying to pass, as I record this, that would bar district courts from issuing such nationwide injunctions. Meanwhile, Bob issues more executive orders targeting law firms that donate to Republicans, litigate against unions, represented January 6 people, or who assisted the administration during Trump's term. He targets these firms by removing the security clearances from its attorneys and canceling all federal contracts with the firms. Bob also threatens to withhold federal funds from any universities that fail to teach gender study courses, do not allow trans people to compete in women's sports, or do not teach that America is an inherently racist country. He directs the EEOC to open investigations into every conservative law firm that does not have a DEI program. Bob implements tariffs on European countries with right-wing governments while dropping them on Mexico, Canada, and left-wing European countries. Using his wartime authority under the Defense Production Act, Bob directs the government to fast-track all affordable energy projects and especially solar projects, which benefits his family who have business dealings with solar panel producers in China. Using the power of impoundment, which is the power of the president to refuse to spend funds Congress has appropriated for a certain purpose, Bob cuts the Department of Defense's funding in half, claiming that DoD has become a hotbed of corruption due to the influence of defense contractors and that the cut is necessary to reduce waste. He revokes access to the White House press pool for all right-wing media outlets. He also threatens to use the FCC to revoke the broadcast licenses of any media outlets who claim that the 2032 election had security issues or allowed individuals to vote fraudulently. When Texas's governor makes statements critical of Bob just before a nasty Category 5 hurricane hits Texas from the now renamed Gulf of Mexico, Bob threatens to withhold disaster relief unless the governor issues a retraction and apology and promises to stop prosecuting doctors who conduct abortions within the state. He does the same to Florida when it gets hit by a hurricane later that year, and to Alabama when it's hit by a devastating series of tornadoes. Now, I'm not an expert on conservatives, but I'm guessing nothing in that parade of horribles sounds like something you'd be thrilled with. But while the content of all these executive actions is all very different from what Trump is doing, the fiat, the claims of authority, the exercises of power that underlie these actions are all identical to ones that Trump is now either exercising or arguing he has the right to exercise. Everything I just described would simply involve a liberal president flipping the levers of power that Trump has created for the presidency. And it's not like he or any other conservative president is going to wake up one day and say, gee, today I will go out and give myself less power to achieve my agenda and my priorities. And guess what? Every single one of these new areas of power will just be turned against you the moment a liberal takes office. They will do everything Trump did, but in reverse. Hell, they'll even go further than Trump. Use the new normalization of expanded executive authority to do things that we can't even dream of right now. Unless you think that conservatives are going to win every presidential election for the rest of time, which, I'm sorry, is a naive assumption. That's what's waiting at the end of this tunnel. A liberal president stepping into the White House with more power to wreck the nation than any president has ever had before. To keep that from happening, the only course is to declaw the federal government and redirect its power to somewhere where it can't be abused. That's exactly what localism wants to do. When your local government has full authority of self-rule and is at the top of the preemption pyramid, Congress and the president can only touch your community if you let them. It doesn't matter how big the White House's power has gotten, or whether it's a red or blue ass sitting in the Oval Office, if you can just override federal law by passing a local law. Full local rule where you and your community members get to call all the shots has to be the better way to go than being under the thumb of a distant liberal autocrat or getting stuck in the cycle of active conservative presidents expanding executive power that liberals then abuse. Okay, sure, so maybe all the fun stuff with the executive right now will eventually become a bit less fun. But the president's not the only part of government. Conservatives currently control both houses of Congress. Surely that's got to be worth something, right? Surely when it's your guys on your team in charge of the federal legislature, that's got to be better than anything localism and local self-rule can offer. Right? Well, what has that lovely full Republican Congress done since taking office? They did pass the, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this name, Lockin-Riley Act, which was a genuine W for conservatives. It's named after that poor woman who was killed by an illegal immigrant in 2024 and basically directs the Department of Homeland Security to use ICE to detain and remove illegal immigrants who are charged with crimes like theft. Aside from that, well, they did pass that continuing resolution, the CR, you know, that fucked up thing the federal government does these days where instead of actually passing a budget for the year, they passed like 100-page laws at the last minute with who knows what's inside of it that basically kicks the can down the road for a few months. The thing that conservatives hate because it just locks federal spending in place and absolutely removes any chance of reducing the deficit. Well, even in control of both houses of Congress, conservatives still passed a CR. Probably that's just because the numbers in the Senate are what they are and they needed to get some liberal votes to get past the filibuster. But part of it is because the uniparty moderate Republicans refuse to take a hardline stance against government spending. As a liberal, what I think the Republican Party could have done is banded together, passed a budget with significant cuts to the federal government that would have cut into the deficit, and dared liberals like me to either get on board or be responsible for shutting the government down. Like, the bad outcome here would have been a shutdown, which would mean that overreaching federal agencies can't operate, and DOJ would have been given full carte blanche to do its work. Liberal obstructionists would have shouldered the blame for refusing to work with conservatives to keep the government open, or would have been forced to admit defeat and accept significant cuts. But business-as-usual career politicians instead decided to take the path of respectability and institutionalism, or whatever, and pass something more palatable to the left. Which, hey, I'm happy with that. But for you, Congress's accomplishments this term have basically been one good law on immigration and one milquetoast, ineffectual budgetary move. It's not like some conservatives haven't been trying to swing for the fences, especially in the House. They've introduced laws that do stuff like abolishing the ATF or sanctioning countries that cooperate with the International Criminal Court or authorizing the use of military force against Mexican cartels. But Congress and the federal government as a whole is just too slow and too entrenched to really make change happen on anything that resembles a reasonable timeline through the legislative process. I mean, we're at what? $36.2 trillion of debt? That's more than $100,000 of debt per American citizen. We're running a $1.2 trillion budgetary deficit every year. And the budget plan that House conservatives are kicking around right now, not that super weak one that the Senate passed and that the House probably won't pass, specifically the more aggressive one that the House passed that has a bunch of cuts in it, well, it would also increase the federal debt ceiling, the amount of money America is legally allowed to be put in debt by, to $40.1 trillion. Oh yeah, the classic conservative ask of putting America another $4 trillion in debt from what it is right now. That would be a ridiculous thing for even liberals to try and do, and they'd get dragged for it. But despite the fact that it's clearly ideologically inconsistent for so-called conservatives to push for putting us all a few trillion more in debt, it is not at all surprising that that's exactly what congressional conservatives want. Because this is just federal politics business as usual kind of stuff. When it's people wearing your jerseys in Congress, you want to raise the debt limit. When it's people wearing different jerseys, you call the other team names. Both conservatives and liberals are guilty of this. These dynamics are just part and parcel of how the federal government works at this point. Bold, effective, fast action will never be achievable through Congress. Instead, to change things on the ground, it just makes sense to have binding decisions made on the ground. Immediacy means speed and flexibility. It means not having to go through the whole federal circus before you can just pass sensible laws in your own community. It means no room for power to accumulate and congeal in some distant capital or in the hands of party insiders. Localism's goals of making local governments be the highest lawmaking bodies in the land, and for citizens to make decisions for themselves via directly democratic procedures in those local governments, creates exactly the kind of environment where conservative policies can actually be implemented within a reasonable period of time, and without having to contend with liberal outsiders from elsewhere in the country or the state. All that needs to happen is for you and your neighbors to get together, decide to do something, and then go exercise your political agency directly by voting to pass a law. Assuming that most people in your community agree with you, that law is going to pass. Ordinary people making common sense decisions about how the world and the government should be. Doesn't that sound more in line with the conservative ethos than handing lawmaking authority over to a bunch of millionaire party elites who then sit on their hands and clutch at their pearls rather than represent your interests? Okay, let's put aside current events for a moment and look at a couple deeper political trends. It's often said that most square miles of America are conservative, and this is totally true. Any quick look at a political map of the country will prove it. There is certainly no doubt that most square miles of America are conservative. Because of this, you might expect that conservatives have a lot of self-determinative power and political agency in America. To an extent, this is true. We see stuff like the Electoral College or the way senators are assigned that give smaller rural areas a place at the table that can challenge larger, more liberal places. But in general, low population conservative areas are one of the most politically disempowered parts of America. This is true about the federal level and the state level. At the federal level, you find that more sparsely populated conservative areas sometimes have their voices drowned out by a small handful of liberal population centers. That's why there are many nationwide elections that swing Congress the way of liberals or put a liberal in the presidency only because of the votes in places like New York City, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Chicago, etc. That's because while it's true that the vast majority of places in America are conservative, it is increasingly becoming less the case that the average person in America is conservative. We are living in a time of unprecedented urbanization. More and more people are living in cities and leaving rural areas than any other time in the nation's history. In 2020, 80% of the entire country lived in urban areas. This represented the latest in a growing trend. 73% of people lived in cities as of 1980, 64% of people lived in cities as of 1950. The last time that more people lived in rural areas than cities, which means the last time that more people lived in areas that now lean conservative instead of leaning liberal, was in the 1910s, and 45.6% of Americans lived in cities at that time. To be clear, this is painting with a very broad brush. It is not automatically the case that everyone who lives in the city is liberal, nor is it the case that every part of the country has the same rate of urbanization. Additionally, COVID represented a time when many individuals with the means to do so left cities and moved into areas that were more rural and more conservative, much to the lamentations of many of the people who had lived in those conservative areas their entire life and were not rich transplants. But these reservations noted there is no escaping the fact that more and more people are starting to live in cities every year, and that people who live in cities are significantly more likely to be liberal than people who live in rural areas. That's how you end up in situations where, despite most parts of America being conservative, America as a whole can still end up being governed by a largely liberal government, put into place by an expanding cohort of liberal voters. Doesn't that just seem intuitively wrong to you? Why is it that this group of people who live in cities hundreds or thousands of miles away from you, who lead lives that are so different than the life you lead, who don't know anything about what it's like to live where you live or the problems that your community faces, who hold political ideas so different from your own, who hold personal values that are so different from your own, are nevertheless the ones who get to dictate to you from afar how things should be run in your own community? It's just not fair. Someone living on a ranch in Texas shouldn't have to explain themselves to a Hollywood billionaire. A data scientist in New York lacks the frame of reference and the lived experience to have the right to tell a farmer in Idaho how to live. But because cities are swelling while rural populations stay the same or decline slightly, both of which are due to factors that your average conservative person has no control over or no responsibility for, the Hollywood billionaire and the New York data scientist are the ones who get to call the shots nationwide. Surely there must be a better, more reasonable, more accountable system that allows people to decide for themselves how things should be in their own community, without having to answer to distant, disapproving interests. And we see exactly the same dynamic play out in miniature at the state level. In some ways, that dynamic is even worse at the state level because of how much control the state government has over local governments within the state. Remember, under Dillon's rule, the prevailing theory for how local government and state government interact, the state government has essentially absolute authority over the local government, because the local government is nothing but a creature or creation or subordinate servant of the state government. This is how you end up with situations or states that are an ocean of red with one or two teeny tiny blue islands, but still are effectively ruled by Democrats. I mean, seriously, pull up a political map of Oregon. Oregon is like maybe 2 Democrat regions. Everything else is a conservative community. And yet, because of increasing urbanization, the state government will ultimately be filled with people that those 2 liberal areas elect. It will represent the interests of those liberal groups, and it will attempt to impose their liberal political program on everyone in the state equally, regardless of where they live. If you're liberal like me, hey, that doesn't sound so bad, but if you're conservative, that sounds awful. I'm picking on Oregon a little bit here, but you can see almost identical situations in states like New York, California, Washington, Virginia. The list goes on. Take it from someone who has lived in a conservative county in a state that will never be governed by anyone other than liberals. There is no worse feeling for someone living in a conservative, rural part of the state than knowing that your voice will always be disregarded and will never matter, because a host of people who live in a different and distant community will always outnumber you, and as such will always be the ones who win in elections and pass the laws that reach out to touch your locality. To reiterate, I am a bleeding heart bureaucrat coastal elite lefty, but I feel pretty comfortable when I say there's something about conservatives that a lot of people don't understand, and something that I saw time and time again growing up, is that it is miserable and crushing to feel like you don't matter, that your state and your country and even the world has moved past you or has ceased to listen to you because it no longer considers you important. It's easy for people in that position to sort of fall under the sway of extreme ideas and hateful opinions, because lashing out at the world at least lets you feel like you're clawing back some of that control, some of that importance. In my view, that doesn't make the hate right, but it does explain why it can more easily take root. I think a lot of the vitriol in America's current politics is due to the billionaire interests that control media companies, make the media content of those companies increasingly polarized, and then benefit when this increased media polarization creates an increasingly polarized electorate that then increasingly consumes more polarized media and occupies polarized media spaces in a kind of fucked up induced demand catch-22. A lot of the vitriol also comes from the feeling of some people involved in the debate that they've lost their agency and that their actions and decisions don't really matter anymore when it comes to politics. My suspicion is that if more parts of the country were given more ability to self-govern, and the average person was given more of an ability to have their political decisions and preferences translate into actual outcomes, the temperature would lower in our debates and in a lot of our divides. But that's not the system we have now. Under the system we have now, the average square mile of America is ruled from afar by liberal people in a densely populated city. And unless something changes, this trend is only going to intensify over the coming decades. It may come to a point where there are so many people living in these liberal centers that even the somewhat tenuous grasp on power as conservatives occasionally enjoy could begin to disappear. The appearance of a Donald J. Trump type is not enough standing alone to escape these realities. What is enough to escape these realities is a complete alteration of how American government functions, an alteration that places power in the hands of those who live in these conservative rural areas that are currently being ruled from afar. If these areas were allowed to govern themselves, and these liberal cities were allowed to handle their own affairs in their own backyard, but not to reach out their hand into corners of the country where they have no business being, then it won't matter how many people decide to live in these cities or how many people decide to live in rural areas. Every community self-governs, and so no community has any outside sway over any other community. This is exactly what localism promises. It promises the ability of every community to govern itself free from any concern about whether it's the biggest place in the country or the most populous or the most moneyed or the most politically important because of who happens to live there. Full self-rule for every locality would mean an America that is mostly occupied by self-governing conservative communities that no longer must attempt to navigate the gauntlet of a state and federal political field where conservatives are outnumbered by liberals. So that, in a nutshell, is pretty much my pitch for why conservatives should consider hopping on board and working with people across the entire political aisle, including liberals like myself, to achieve localism. Despite recent conservative successes at the federal level, these successes often come at the cost of expanding federal authority, meaning that expanded federal authority is ripe for use and misuse once liberals assume power. The conservative Congress is too slow and too entrenched in its machine politics ways to actually achieve the change that you want to see. And the sheer math of who lives where means that usually conservative rural areas will be stuck under the weight of larger populations and blue-leaning cities. I don't think any of these are particularly controversial or complicated or even new premises. You know these are true. You know these are true because you've lived the reality that the truth has created and come to know its unpleasant consequences. By inverting the pyramid of preemption, allowing every community, conservative or liberal, to govern itself, localism will destroy all of these unwanted phenomena and replace them with a society where every community gets to decide for itself what laws it will obey and what governmental actions reflect the values and preferences of its citizens. No rule from afar, no external forces looking over your shoulder and judging you for the things that you believe or dictating to you how things should be run in your own backyard. Just you and your neighbors and your family passing laws for yourselves and trying to make a better world. Hopefully these thoughts are striking a chord with you, but I also think it'd be a good idea to do a quick lightning round to discuss causes conservatives care about and how localist America will allow conservatives to more powerfully act in those areas than the current top-down federal system. In no particular order, let's jump in. Tariffs. Clearly, a lot of conservatives are really excited by Trump's idea to use tariffs to revitalize domestic manufacturing. They elected him with a mandate to use the powers of the presidency and implement tariffs that would incentivize reshoring and create good American jobs. And how does he use that mandate? With a bunch of waffling, mostly. He announces a tariff one day and then announces 3 exceptions to it the next day and then says, wait, just kidding, we're not going to implement it at all. He seems to view tariffs less as a legitimate economic tool and more as a bargaining chip to extract other concessions out of countries. Sure, he did just recently go full sicko mode and implement the most aggressive set of tariffs in modern American history, only to roll them back about 3 days later when his buddies on Wall Street got spooked by how much money they were losing. Well, some people may actually be serious about the idea of tariffs as a way to make the American economy strong again and reduce our reliance on a globalized economy. They may want to see a serious type of program implemented, one that is announced, stays in place for a long enough time to realign incentives, and truly forces large multinational companies to start making and building things in America. If you're serious about that, it's good that the National Republican Party is not necessarily on board with you, and that even when tariffs' greatest champion is in the Oval Office, the likelihood of actual tariff programs sticking around is very low. Localism would mean that you and your community members could get together and immediately vote to implement tariffs on certain goods that aren't made within your community or certain areas around your community. No reliance on how the president happens to be feeling that morning or whether he thinks it's a good idea to create all these exemptions that let some of the worst offenders of offshoring continue their bad practices. No need to try and consider how a tariff that makes sense in your community could impact or hurt people who live in a different community. Just you, your neighbors, and your fellow community members seeing where there are areas of opportunity to bring economic activity into your community and then crafting tariff policy based on those observations. The forever war. One thing that's increasingly clear to people on all sides of the aisle, but especially conservatives in recent years, which is very weird considering how most of political history in America has worked, is that America's entanglements abroad are becoming unsustainable and inadvisable. We are constantly dragged into conflicts on distant shores involving countries that turn to us with their hands outstretched, demanding support. The current Republican administration has partially delivered on the idea of us getting out of these entanglements. You can see this in the way that conservatives at the federal level have realigned their policy towards Ukraine. But even as federal level conservatives attempt to extricate the country from a messy and expensive conflict in Europe, they are doing the exact opposite in other parts of the world. Saudi Arabia and Israel say jump, and federal conservatives ask, how high? Hell, as I write this, Trump is moving bombers near Iran, presumably to make good on his threats to attack the country or to spend even more money bombing the Houthis, which so far has done fuck all, what has pumping billions and billions and billions of dollars, not to mention the blood of tens of thousands of our young men and women, actually accomplished for our country. Our supposed allies in the Middle East take and take and take in order to further their regional or political ambitions and expect us to foot the bill not just willingly, but eagerly. And for what? Is the Middle East solved? Have stability been restored? Do all indications suggest that soon our involvement will no longer be necessary? No. No, no, no. Quite the opposite. Unless something changes, our children and our children's children and our children's children's children will still be sending their hard-earned tax dollars to some country in the Middle East that's using it to blow people up for essentially no benefit to America. Despite their claims to be putting America first, federal conservatives continue to put America last by pouring treasure and blood into the bottommost pit of the Middle East, either in the naive hope that it will actually achieve something, which would mean that conservatives are stupid, or out of outright malevolence and the desire for personal profit. There simply is no way to square federal conservatives' alleged dedication to reducing our footprint and entanglement abroad with federal conservatives' simultaneous championing of a heavily interventionist and highly expensive Middle East policy that has produced absolutely no tangible results over the past 3 decades. Since federal conservatives seem intent on continuing on this path, localism and local self-rule is what's needed to achieve the conservative goal of putting America first and refusing to act as the world police. Under localism, you and your community could vote to not send young people to fight in these forever wars, to not pay taxes that will be spent on maintaining military bases abroad, and to not provide much-needed bombs and ammo and military equipment to perennial beggars like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Absent the kind of realignment towards local power that localism enables, in 30 years, you will still be beholden to national politicians that claim to be for America first, while in practice prioritizing support for foreign regimes and foreign conflicts that do not benefit you whatsoever. Immigration. You might think that right now represents a triumph, an amazing moment of victory for conservatives who wanted to see a more hardline immigration policy. I would offer that there's nothing further from the truth. Conservatives in the border states have wanted to take a more aggressive stance towards illegal immigration for years. They saw themselves as being at the front of a crisis that imposed unique costs on those who lived directly along the border. Despite being in this unique position, they had no ability to act for themselves to address this crisis, and instead had to wait for an often unwilling federal government to step in and take the lead. Sure, things seem okay now, but you had to wait at least 4 years and an entire administration for the cavalry to charge over the hill and save you. In a better system, those communities right along the border would be able to decide for themselves what immigration measures were best, and would have the authority to implement those measures immediately rather than wait for the gears of the state and federal government to grind. This also means that those communities who live along the border can make decisions without having to justify themselves to distant liberal interests who are relatively untouched by the negative externalities of immigration, but nevertheless are given an equal or even superior role in dictating what happens in those communities that they live hundreds or thousands of miles away from and that are next to the border. Localism means every community getting to decide for itself, right this instant, how it wants to approach the issue of immigration and how to confront the on-the-ground realities that immigration is causing. Abortion. Look, abortion is an issue that I feel extremely strongly about in a way that is likely vastly different from how you view the issue. I think that Dobbs was an aberration and a horrible example of what can happen when unelected judges get to decide that you no longer enjoy a constitutional right. To me, abortion is a bodily autonomy issue and should be up to every person to decide what they do with their body, whether that be with abortion, vaccines, or any other medical action. So my view on this is going to be altered by my personal opinions on this issue, so feel free to take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But it's my personal opinion that a national abortion ban will never pass in America. It is simply an issue on which there are too many moderates and that presents too great a political risk to too many federal conservatives. We've seen time and time again that this is a toxic issue and a loser for conservatives when they attempt to make it part of their national platforms. And we've also seen that, a couple attempts in the House aside, there's been no real effort by this conservative administration to try and push for a national abortion ban. Trump himself has said that it is his position that it's a decision that should be left to the states, and that he believes that it should be left at the states so that different citizens across the country can exercise their own judgment about how to approach this controversial issue. Localism takes that basic premise and turns it up to 11. Instead of people all over the country getting to decide this issue on a state-by-state basis, localism instead allows communities to make this important decision on a locality-by-locality level, a much more granular level. This means both that the values of urban liberal voters in large cities won't end up being determinative for how things should be run in smaller, more rural, more conservative areas. It also means that it's possible for individual communities with particularly strong convictions about abortion one way or the other to make their own judgments without having to grapple against other people at the state or federal level who have their own preferences on this issue, or have their local decision infringe on the rights of others elsewhere in the country. A localist system that allows for full self-rule is the most viable way for individual communities to decide either to enshrine abortion as a right, or to remove the ability for individuals to have access to that procedure. For both liberals and conservatives, an alternative solution that would require state or federal level change is just too slow, too expensive, too burdensome, too subject to the cold political calculus of uncaring federal political parties, and too bound up in top-down preemption to avoid the risk that a judgment in one corner of the country will de facto become a decision on how things should operate in the entire country. Education. So put a pin in this one for now, because as I'll mention at the end of the show, the topic of the next episode will be all about education and will inevitably bring up reasons why both conservatives and liberals would rather have education be handled via localism. But to give a very brief preview, the big educational push in conservative circles this past decade is to give parents more control over what is taught in classrooms, and for localities to be the ones to make decisions about what's good for kids rather than state or federal government. Localism would allow all of these important issues to be handled by localities, with the state and federal government having no ability to set curriculum or impose standards or limit the participatory role of parents. Gun rights. Localism will preserve one of the best things about the current American system of government for conservatives, which is the Constitution's Bill of Rights. That includes the Second Amendment. So rest assured that localism will not at all limit your right to keep and bear arms. Quite the opposite. It is almost certain to enhance that right. Notwithstanding the Second Amendment, federal courts have found that multiple types of gun control and other gun regulations are nevertheless constitutional. This means that federal and state political interests can reduce the scope of your right to keep and bear arms, even if they cannot eliminate it entirely. As anyone who has ever lived in a conservative county in an overall blue state can tell you, this can lead to some very invasive and often nonsensical regulations championed by urban liberals. Under localism, it would no longer be a distant federal capital or a distant liberal center in your state that dictates your firearm policy. Want to implement constitutional carry? Comfortable with the idea of ghost guns and bump stocks? Think that the current requirements around background checks and gun show purchases are too restrictive? Convinced that assault rifle is often a legal phrase defined by people who have never even touched a firearm? Under localism, you and your neighbors are the ones who get to decide how gun rights should work in your community. You get to say, here's what you're allowed to do in our neighborhood, and if you don't like the way that you run things here, feel free to go somewhere else. Now, to a pencil-neck liberal like myself, I don't think I'd be very comfortable living in a community where anyone can just concealed carry without having to go out and get a permit. And I think a lot of my liberal brethren living in cities would agree. But that's the beautiful thing about localism. You don't have to care about what liberals like me think anymore. You and your neighbors get to decide what rules should apply and what relationship with firearms is best for your community. If I want to implement stricter gun laws in my little blue corner of the country, that won't affect you at all, because those regulations will only apply within exactly my locality's jurisdiction. Taxes. It's probably not much fun watching your tax dollars go to social programs that support the causes you don't believe in, right? And probably pretty frustrating in general how deep the deficit continues to grow despite the fact that your taxes seem to get hiked every few years. Federal conservatives aren't necessarily doing you a bunch of favors with their policy decisions, including such gems as raising the debt ceiling by a couple $1 trillion and getting us involved in whatever Middle Eastern conflict requires a few billion in military equipment this week. Just as I'm writing this, the Conservative Senate just passed a budget law with an increase of deficit by about $2 trillion, but only cutting maybe a few $1 billion of spending. This is that sort of milquetoast weak spending bill I referenced earlier. Things aren't much better on the state level. Even pretty conservative states still tend to have things like income taxes. 42 states in the union currently levy some kind of individual income tax. And of those few that do choose to get rid of the income tax, they tend to then turn around and make up any supposed lifting of a tax burden by simply increasing taxes in other areas, such as sales taxes. The upshot, whether at the federal or state level, is the government reaching its hand into your pocket and taking your money to spend in ways that conservatives deem wasteful at best and fraudulent at worst. Localism offers a way out of this unwelcome intrusion into your personal finances by inverting the pyramid of preemption, thereby making local governments the highest forms of authority within their own jurisdictions. This allows you and your neighbors via the local government to make all judgments about how taxes should work in your community. And you can ensure that all the taxes you do end up paying can stay in your community, to the benefit of yourselves and the people you care about, rather than being extracted and spent on external parties or in furtherance of social goals you disagree with. Now, as your friendly neighborhood lib, I feel compelled to say that I think it would be very stupid to wake up and decide that taxes aren't a thing anymore and that everything is going to be managed by the private market and nobody has to pay property or income or sales taxes anymore. But hey, that's none of my business. Your community, your rules. That's the basic premise of localism. Public safety. The defund police movement has generally been spearheaded by a few large liberal urban centers. However, because the residents of those large urban centers often hold disproportionate sway on the state and federal governments because of their large population sizes, the decision to redirect funding from police forces has extended beyond the few communities that have decided to try it and has touched localities across the country. You and your fellow community members may believe that a strong police force and well-funded emergency services are the best way to deter and address issues in your community. Finances aside, you may also think that certain legal limitations on what police officers can do or the methods they can utilize to catch criminals are inadvisable and would want to give police greater carte blanche to do their jobs. Not sure how any conservative who claims to want to limit the authority of what the government can do would want to give police a blank check to do whatever they want, but hey, if that's what you think is best, localism would give you the power to make that decision for your community. Separate from the issue of policing, you may disagree with some judgments reflected in state and federal criminal laws. You may think that the federal government criminalizes things like possession of firearms too harshly, or that your state government criminalizes things like possession of drugs or assault of a minor too leniently. Now, it is true that even in the current American system of government, local governments have some power to pass criminal laws. That doesn't change the fact of preemption and that a local government cannot override or alter criminal laws that have been passed at the state or federal level. Under localism, you and your community could ensure both that your emergency responders have the resources and support they need to effectively keep your community safe, and also decide for yourself what behavior should be criminalized and how significant the penalties for such violations should be. To reiterate something that I have brought up multiple times before, your community can't go too far in this direction because it will still be limited by the rights accorded to Americans by the federal constitution and your state constitution. Localism does not change anything about the need of local governments to preserve the civil liberties granted by the federal constitution and state constitutions, so you can't do anything like mess with due process or something like that. But localism would still give you significantly more authority in deciding how to structure local public safety systems and in passing laws that govern criminal activity. Deregulation. Probably the worst aspect of the federal government for conservatives is the myriad of alphabet soup agencies that have the power to pass binding preemptive law despite being essentially constituted by unelected bureaucrats. The amount of federal regulations that cover economic and individual behavior is staggering. If you're a conservative, you likely think that in a more deregulated environment, people will be able to lead freer and more prosperous lives. Of course, federal level regulation is only half the battle. Less known but highly impactful state agencies also steadily pump out law after law. Conservative states are no exception, with Wyoming, generally considered one of the most right-wing states in the nation, still having dozens of state-level agencies. What works in one place will not work in another, which is another problem with these overarching federal agencies. They're trying to regulate the whole country instead of on a state-by-state or community-by-community basis. The steps needed to prevent pollution in a densely populated urban location may just be an unwelcome and unwarranted economic intrusion in rural conservative areas. Now, obviously, I'm about to say, what a coincidence, localism can help solve these problems, but some of you might be asking why to bother with localism when the President Doge has seen a lot of success dismantling executive agencies. This, like everything else in this episode, is going to be an extremely biased take, but the truth is that Trump and Elon don't actually give a shit about getting rid of agencies just for the sake of getting rid of agencies. They specifically just want to get rid of agencies that they see as getting in the way of their priorities, and are more than happy to keep or even empower agencies that they think are useful. You're not going to see Trump just empowering the FBI or DOJ or DHS anytime soon. He's going to keep around the EEOC as long as it's a useful tool for intimidating law firms or other enemies in the private sector. And, of course, DOJ itself is actually the outgrowth of a pre-existing executive agency. DOJ is, at least on paper, just another agency with unelected bureaucrats that are doing whatever they want with no democratic accountability. Okay, let my biases get the better of me on that one, but the point still stands that federal or state conservatives will never fully dismantle the administrative state, so long as keeping parts of it around can further their, or Wall Street's, interests. The only way to really get out from under these regulatory bodies is to embrace localism. Then and only then will you get to pick and choose which, if any, regulations you think make sense, and which ones you're going to override. Election security. One of the defining issues splitting conservatives from liberals right now is the question of election security. Liberals tend to trust that our small R Republican elections fairly represent actual votes cast. Conservatives tend to think that fraud and illegal activity is commonplace during elections. I'm not here to settle that debate. What I am here to do is suggest that localism would provide a lot of very useful tools to communities that are concerned about election integrity. For one, assuming your community decides to embrace both localism's inversion of the preemption pyramid and also its use of directly democratic procedures, there won't be any more elections because there won't be any more elected representatives. Instead, you and your neighbors will engage yourself more directly by casting votes on legislation yourselves. You'll all be legislators, rather than just leaving the job to a handful of career political types. The toughest part of the security-wise will be tracking proxy delegations and who has the right to vote, but that can be done via pretty common-sense measures. For another, part of the reason that security problems can arise in a voting system is because the system is so big that it's damn near impossible to keep something from slipping through the cracks. Think about how many votes and how many polling places there are across the entire country for something like a presidential election. Think of how much there is to keep track of even in a state-level election for something like governor. With localism, assuming the community isn't interested in embracing direct democracy, the most important elections will be local ones. It's necessarily going to be a lot less trouble to keep a careful eye on election security within a single community than it would be to do on a state or federal level. With these factors aside, it's also true that under localism, localities could decide for themselves what steps are needed to make elections truly secure. This could include things like requiring use of hand-counted paper ballots, limiting mail-in voting to people who have disabilities, requiring voters to present certain kinds of identification documents on election day, and posting stricter criminal penalties on those who engage in election fraud. You get the drift. Personally, I'm not convinced that any of this stuff would actually make elections safer, but hey, if this is what you want to do, knock yourself out. Just remember that even under localism, the federal and state constitutions, civil protections still apply, so you can't do things that infringe upon the rights of citizens to vote. But so long as you don't try to interfere with those protections, localism allows your community to implement security measures that state or federal governments lack the political will to adopt, or that would be burdensome to implement on the state or countrywide level, but are doable when administered on the scale of one community. And that's my pitch for why conservatives should consider getting onto the coalition of localism. I know that the meme of "we're a Big Tent group" is sort of played out and often doesn't mean that much, but at the risk of being cliche, this really is a Big Tent issue. You may remember way back when I was talking about how home rule works, and I noted that whether or not a state had decided to grant home rule didn't seem to track traditional political boundaries. I genuinely believe that localism is not a left or right issue, and is instead a question about who we think should be the ones in charge of our government and our laws. That's why I start every episode of the show by saying, this is Localism, the show that asks whether we're putting our power in the right places. And consistent with that view, I think localism has a lot to offer conservatives. It gives you a system of government that's focused entirely on the smallest form of government, the one that's most immediate and most responsive to the people. It gets you out from underneath these big distant urban cities that so often feel like they're making judgments on your behalf. And I think the underlying theory of localism, you should be able to call the shots in your own backyard and let others do the same in their backyards, is very appealing to the conservative value system. To repeat what I hope I was extremely clear about the whole time, my politics personally are left-wing. I'm not a conservative. I don't claim that I can really truly understand what it is conservatives want or fully represent your breadth of political views. Maybe you come out of this episode thinking, oh man, this guy does not get it. He has totally missed the point. That's not what I'm hoping for, but I could live with it. What I am hoping for is that you don't come out of this thinking, this guy's just trying to pull the wool over his eyes. He doesn't believe any of this stuff he's saying. He's just another coastal elite with a big idea that he's trying to trick conservatives to get on board with so that liberals can control everything. I hope the way I've approached this discussion and been clear about my values and biases has shown that I'm trying to be intellectually honest in the points I'm making about localism is something that conservatives should be a part of. Even if I don't convince you that localism is a path you want to pursue, I hope I at least convince you that I'm sincere and thinking that this is something that you should consider and that I've been forthright in presenting my genuine opinion for why that's the case. One last thing before we go. I've given localism kind of a utopian bent for conservatives in this episode. I really recommend, both because I could use the viewer and listener numbers, but also because I think it's important for the sake of transparency, that you go and listen to the liberal case for localism too. I think before you decide that this is something you're interested in or want to support, you should see how localism could be used to create a liberal society in some communities that is probably very different than the one that you'd like to see created. Absent an understanding of those consequences and what liberal applications of localism could look like, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that you're really informed supporters who have done a good job of showing the full consequences of this idea I have. So go please listen to the liberal case for localism, which I released today alongside this episode. And that's it for today's show, or, well, I guess I should say today's shows. I wanted to release these Case for Localism episodes as a way to drive engagement, selfishly, and also to show how localism can be in conversation with two very sets of political ideas at the same time. And you know what? I think it was good for the show to engage ideas of localism with more straightforwardly contemporary sets of political issues. It's not really all that useful for my audience if all I talk about is railroad companies and boards of public works in the 1900s. So when I heard that Trump was getting ready to close down the Department of Education, I was like, oh man, there's a bunch of things I could say about this and how it reflects on the idea of localism. Let's keep up this trend of making things a little more grounded and a little more responsive to the events that are happening in our country in a time that, no matter what your political party is, I think we can all admit is pretty unusual and interesting. So, next episode, a localist analysis of Trump closing the Ed Department. If that sounds interesting, be sure to catch the next episode on Spotify or YouTube, and feel free to drop me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. See you then. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.